seizing central space immediately. This opening gambit opens diagonal lines for swift piece development and influence. Developing the knight to its most active square immediately, contests the center and prepares for queenside expansion. Securing the center with a pawn offers a powerful territorial advantage. Preparing a fianchetto, this move secures the bishop and begins challenging white's central pawn structure. Solidifying the center and developing a knight, this prepares to control key squares while keeping options open for further pawn advances. Unveiling the fianchettoed bishop establishes long-term diagonal pressure, a cornerstone of this setup. Establishing central dominance, this advance promises a fight for space and initiative. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing development, this central thrust aims to contest space and prevent white's ambitious pawn advances. Developing the kingside pawns opens a clear path for the bishop to join the queenside attack, creating a formidable pawn chain. Securing the monarch is paramount, and this castling elegantly tucks it away. Pinnacle development solidifies kingside control, preparing for a central pawn push and discouraging early enemy kingside advances. Challenging white's central pawn structure head-on, black opens lines and seeks active counterplay, potentially creating exciting tactical possibilities. Securing the knight for potential queenside expansion subtly prepares for pawn breaks while maintaining flexibility. Unpinning the knight immediately and threatening to disrupt white's pawn structure creates dynamic possibilities. This sharpens the pawn structure, aiming to exploit black's slightly passive development and potentially create weaknesses around their king. Repositioning the bishop to an active square, it now eyes the central pawn structure. White seizes central territory, aiming to cramp black's king's side pawns and restrict piece mobility. Repositioning the bishop to d7 aims to untangle black's pieces and prepare for potential c6 or nbd7 pawn breaks. Solidifying the pawn chain's integrity and preparing for a kingside pawn storm, this bishop aims to bolster the central structure. Unlocking the queenside's potential, black begins a pawn thrust to contest central space and potentially open lines for their pieces. Connecting the rook streamlines queenside expansion and bolsters the central e4 pawn's defense. The knight's hop to the edge of the board initiates a flank attack, seeking to disrupt white's central grip and potentially establish an outpost. Unpinning the knight frees the central pawn chain and prepares for potential kingside expansion. A prudent redeployment, the queen finds a more active post, eyeing the queenside pawn structure and potentially supporting a future c5 push. Initiating a kingside pawn storm, a double-edged strategy that could expose the monarch if the attack falters. Suddenly, black lunges a knight to the edge, probing for tactical weaknesses and aiming to disrupt white's central control. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside aims to pry open lines and exploit black's potentially exposed monarch. Challenging white's pawn chain on the kingside, this advance creates crucial counterplay on the queenside. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure, this move prevents any immediate knight incursions and prepares for potential queenside expansion. The knight abandons its outpost, potentially surrendering the queenside initiative for a less defined role. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure, this move braces against potential knight incursions while subtly preparing for queenside expansion. This knight, seemingly misplaced, now eyes the central squares, subtly challenging white's pawn phalanx and preparing a potential knight fork. Consolidating the queenside pawn structure, this rook anchors its defense and prepares for potential queenside advances or even a strategic retreat if pressure mounts. Black boldly challenges white's pawn chain, seeking to disrupt the kingside structure and open new avenues of attack. Exchanging bishop for knight clears the g-file, potentially exposing black's castled king to immediate threats while opening diagonals for white's rooks. This bishop exchange sacrifices central pawn structure influence for improved piece coordination on the queenside. This pawn grab dramatically opens the g-file, creating immediate attacking prospects against black's castled king while sacrificing central pawn presence. The queen retreats, preparing to regroup forces and perhaps challenge the open H-file after the capture. Relocating the king to D1 creates a safer haven, seeking to sidestep potential threats and initiate a smoother endgame transition. Sacrificing the bishop on H4 to open lines and attack the beleaguered white king, though it leaves the queen side underdeveloped. Relocating the king to C2 offers it a safer haven from the open files, preparing for potential pawn advances on the queen side. Seeking queenside counterplay, black offers a pawn exchange, aiming to open lines and activate the rook. Exchanging queens simplifies the position, relieving pressure on white's king and initiating a strategic endgame where pawn structure will be paramount. Opening the file grants black attacking potential, potentially targeting white's somewhat exposed king. Sharpening the bishop's influence on the dark squares, it now eyes potential breakthroughs. Retreating the king to a safer square, this maneuver aims to consolidate the weakened kingside pawn structure. Opening the bishop's diagonal dramatically simplifies the position, leaving black's king exposed. Reclaiming the central pawn advances black's knight to a more active square, eyeing white's king position. Launching a knight to a central outpost, aiming to disrupt black's coordination and seize greater board control. A bold repositioning, aiming to activate the rook and contest the central files. Opening the H-file grants your king valuable breathing room and aims to exploit the isolated pawn structure. Reclaiming the initiative, this pawn grab opens crucial lines for your rook while solidifying your central control. Boldly seizing the open file, white prepares to mobilize the remaining pieces for an assault on black's exposed king. Brings the bishop to a more active outpost, potentially disrupting white's central control. Shifting the rook to G3 reclaims the open G-file and prepares for potential kingside pressure or a central rook lift. Repositioning the rook to the 7th rank promises better coordination and can challenge white's control over the open files. Relocating the king opens a diagonal for the bishop and prepares for potential pawn advances. Black's bishop retreats to F2, a seemingly passive spot, but it aims to re-establish a defensive screen for the king and eye potential central breaks. Doubling rooks on the 3rd rank now exerts immense pressure along the H-file, threatening to unravel black's king defense. Recentralizing the knight offers a more active outpost for the knight, aiming to disrupt white's now exposed monarch. Repositioning the rook to bolster the kingside defense offers flexibility in the evolving middle game. Seeking a robust blockade on the queen side, the bishop attempts to solidify the pawn chain's defensive capabilities. This sharp pawn thrust aims to disrupt black's coordinated pieces and exploit the open king. Sacrificing the pawn to open lines for your rooks and attack white's exposed king feels like a desperate gambit for activity. Centralizing the knight reclaims valuable central squares and sets the stage for a pawn advance. Opening the G-file invites sharp, tactical skirmishes. Reorganizing the rook from the king side allows for a more centralized presence, ready to contest open files or support breakthroughs. Re-establishing the knight's activity is paramount after the pawn structure shifted. Injecting aggression, this check forces black's pieces into a defensive posture and opens lines towards the enemy king. Prioritizing king safety, black sacrifices central space to avoid immediate knight fork danger, creating a somewhat passive pawn structure. Relinquishing the rook opens the G-file for maximum pressure against the black king. Recapturing the piece solidifies black's pawn structure, but the open king remains a significant vulnerability for white. Suddenly, the knight drops back, aiming to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and exploit the open C-file for future pressure. Relocating the king to a more active square, the monarch attempts to escape the central disarray and potentially join the fight on the queen side. Exploiting the open lines, this advance aims to solidify central control and restrict black's knight. Suddenly, black's bishop becomes a well-placed aggressor, eyeing the exposed white king. Bringing the knight to D4 creates a powerful central outpost, eyeing weaknesses in black's pawn structure and potentially controlling key squares for the endgame. Reigniting the kingside pressure, this maneuver seeks to exploit white's slightly exposed monarch, aiming for an active defense. Reclaiming the open h-file to potentially pressure black's king feels like the most pressing order of business.